all of his life, he's going to have issues with money, with women, with authority figures. Folks, we can all relate to at least one of those, and sometimes all three of those if you've had a really interesting life.
So we're welcoming Jim Hessler. He's a historian, an author, a licensed battlefield guide. From what I understand, 23 years now in Gettysburg. I don't think he has enough gray hair to be showing that kind of experience, but he's an author of award-winning books. He's published articles in the Gettysburg magazine. I know him from the Battle of Gettysburg podcast, co-creator and a host, and addressing Gettysburg. He's been done some great appearances on there for Ask a Guide. I would say overall he's an educator, and because everything he does it revolves around teaching us, and he's a great source of knowledge, and I am so thrilled to have him here. So, Jim, if there's anything else you'd like to say before you take it away, I'll just go ahead and give it to you. Okay.
We're going to talk about a very colorful and controversial life today. As I said in the introduction, I've been a licensed battlefield guide at Gettysburg now. This is my 23rd season. I also published a biography of Sickles at Gettysburg in 2009, which is still in print. So I've sort of been doing, as we sort of alluded to in our earlier conversation, I've been doing the Dan Sickles thing for kind of a long time now. One thing I want to get out here, this is sort of my legal disclaimer that I put at the beginning of Sickles presentations, because Dan Sickles, as we'll see, is a controversial, also a polarizing figure in Civil War circles. And I sometimes get individuals coming to these presentations sort of loaded to bear, ready to fight me on Dan Sickles. My intent today is not to get you to like Dan Sickles. I think too many historians and biographers in particular make that mistake. They fall in love with their subjects. Although people have accused me of liking Sickles, I like the story. It is an interesting, colorful story, but it doesn't necessarily mean I support everything this man did, either in his Civil War career or in his life. That is not the point to get people to like this. And it's that old adage, which we've had to remind ourselves in recent years with monuments and with certain flags. At the end of the day, history is not here to make us feel comfortable or to quote unquote like our subjects. But if I have a bias, I do think the Dan Sickles story is an interesting story. And that more than anything is what I want to communicate to you this afternoon. There are three stages to his life. He has more interesting incidents in his life than probably one person is entitled to have. So I often sort of break it up into young Sickles, Civil War Sickles, and old Sickles. Not unlike young Elvis Presley and old Elvis Presley, different phases of the career. As the slide says, he's best remembered for being a noteworthy Civil War figure, and particularly Gettysburg in general, as we often frame a lot of our Civil War experiences, right or wrong, around Gettysburg. Also known as the congressman who got away with murder. I'm going to touch on that a little bit. Dan Sickles was an early battlefield preservationist, something that I think was pretty lost in the literature until my book came out. As I said, colorful character. He's a relatable individual. All of his life, he's going to have issues with money, with women, with authority figures. Folks, we can all relate to at least one of those, and sometimes all three of those if you've had a really interesting life. Dan Sickles is not a marble man that we're going to put on a pedestal and pretend that he didn't have these normal human emotions. And when you put it all together, he's a highly influential figure in the Gettysburg story, and Gettysburg is where I make my living. So we're going to try to cover all of that in about an hour or less. Let's sort of go into the early biographical stats just to kind of get them out of the way. Dan Sickles, he was born in New York City in October of 1819, which would made him just shy of his 44th birthday when he fought at the Battle of Gettysburg. Now, Dan Sickles grew up in a relatively wealthy home. He was an only child, and there are childhood accounts, although we don't have a lot of them, there are a few childhood accounts indicating he was rebellious. Now, I hope I don't offend anybody in the room who fits this criteria, but I've known a few wealthy only children in my lifetime, and they tend to be spoiled and self-centered. They tend to think the universe sort of revolves around them. Some historians have said that Dan Sickles, quote unquote, never grew up, and I think there's definitely some relevance to that, and it could go back to this upbringing. Now, he really came to prominence in New York City politics in the 1840s. He was a self-taught attorney. He got involved with Tammany Hall, that famous Democrat political machine of early New York City, which was well known for graft, kickbacks, and corruption. He was elected to the New York State Assembly. He was a secretary to the Minister to London, future President James Buchanan in the 1850s, and that gave him some not only international experience, but also experience to, at that time, a relatively prominent politician. He was back in the States, and by the 1855, he was one of the early political influencers in the establishment of Central Park in New York City, which would later sort of preview some of the preservation work he would champion on Civil War battlefields. And it all came to a head, culminated when he was elected to Congress in 1856. Now, one thing you'll note is I did not mention any military experience in there. He did not go to West Point. He had no military training. Like a lot of prominent men of that era, he did serve in local militia. He served in the 12th New York State Militia from 1849 to 1853. And in a lot of cases, what does that really mean? It means you get to wear a uniform on parades, and people called him Colonel Sickles. And ironically, if you look at a lot of James Buchanan's surviving correspondence, he actually refers to Sickles as Colonel Sickles. So I guess those were the perks of serving in the militia back in that era. As would befit somebody who came up through Tammany Hall, he was involved in multiple legal actions. He was sued at different times for theft, fraud, forgery. He was also romantically involved with a bordello owner in New York City by the name of Fanny White, and there are some suggestions that he would exchange her services for campaign favors, which would kind of make him both a client and a pimp for Fanny White. But Tammany Hall was well connected. He had well connections. Tammany Hall also could be violent. But one person said that, quote, Sickles, quote, worked hard for the Democratic Party and for himself. He made money and friends. So very influential and not afraid to spend the money. Now, he really comes to national prominence, though, in 1859 while he was in Washington, working his way through his term as a congressman, while his mentor, James Buchanan, was literally living across the street from him in the White House as president. Sickles, Congressman Sickles, came to prominence in February 27th, 1859. Sickles' young wife, Teresa, was having an affair with a friend of Sickles and a prominent district attorney by the name of Philip Barton Key. Key and Mrs. Sickles were having an affair. Sickles found out about it and on February 27th, 1859, confronted Key on the streets of Washington, Lafayette Park, across from the White House, and shot Key dead. Now, if today goes well, I do a whole separate presentation on the murder trial and such because it is fascinating in its own right. We could do a whole separate presentation just on that, sort of a sequel to Sickles at some point. For our intents and purposes today, as we're working through more of a broader biography on him, I often sort of refer to him as a joke as the O.J. Simpson of Sickles. Now, as we said at the outset, I've been a licensed battlefield guide at Gettysburg for 23 years. You'd be surprised 23 years later, you encounter people who don't always know who O.J. Simpson is. And then you got to stop and explain that, and it just gets too messy. But Sickles was arrested, and after a lengthy legal trial, he was eventually acquitted of the murder of Congress or of District Attorney Key. He was acquitted of the murder, and the defense used what has been probably incorrectly remembered as the first temporary insanity defense in United States history. Nevertheless, and I'm not a lawyer, but that's sort of how it's been remembered. So Sickles, the OJ analogy is that this murder trial got huge press coverage, it got huge media coverage for that era. And if you're trying to learn, again, a little more insight about Sickles, the person, we talked about him being a wealthy only child, spoiled, rebellious, clearly a guy who was acquitted on crime of passion, later remembered as temporary insanity, is, to use a great understatement here, an emotional guy. Dan Sickles is an emotional decision maker, and that will influence some of the decisions he makes on Civil War battlefields. And I'll repeat again, I have a whole separate promotion on the murder trial. I'd love to come back and do that with you sometime. As far as the Civil War goes, the upshot of the murder trial was that it did destroy Sickles's high-flying political career at that point. And so when the Civil War started, former Congressman Dan Sickles was out of office, relatively low public opinion when the Civil War started, but he did what you might expect an ambitious politician and attorney to do. When the war started, Sickles gave speeches and he recruited troops. He eventually raised what became known as New York's famed Excelsior Brigade, and he caught the attention of the new Republican president, Abraham Lincoln. I'm sure many of you know the story. Lincoln, the Republican, needs to reach across the aisle to support this unpopular war effort of his. And so he'll take anybody. He'll take immigrants. He'll take Democrats. He'll take even sullied Democrats like Dan Sickles. Now, Lincoln will also say, though, later that he did profess to like what he viewed as a fighting, aggressive spirit among Dan Sickles. And so Lincoln, with help in Washington, will enable Sickles's rise through the Union Army during the early stages of the war. And it follows the normal chain. He goes from colonel of a regiment to brigade command to division command. And by 1863, Dan Sickles is commanding a corps within the Army of the Potomac, despite having none of that military training, none of that West Point training. It is said that Dan Sickles is the highest ranking non-West Pointer in the Union Army during the Battle of Gettysburg. But what I think this period too also shows, and one of the things I do like about the Sickles story and Sickles's personality, is his ability to reinvent himself. That murder trial and the ensuing bad publicity might have finished off most other people, and Sickles would maybe just be a footnote in American history. But that ambition of his, and ambition today is sort of a dirty word to much of the American public, but that ambition of his allowed himself to reinvent himself as a Civil War general, as a Civil War officer. The question is whether he had any competency to do so. Now, one of the things that also worked in his favor too, as a chronic, lifelong womanizer who, although he may or may not physically look it in the pictures, numerous accounts indicate that he was a suave, courteous sort of charmer who could win over these women throughout his life. And one of the people he won over was Mary Todd Lincoln. And that probably helped him at the White House. He could call on the White House at all hours, regardless of whether the president was ready to see him or not. One quote we have from a member of the 154th New York who had seen Sickles and Mary Todd sort of together at a military review in the spring of 1863 noted the man noted that he was prejudiced against Mrs. Lincoln on account of, quote, her shameless conduct and frivolity with General Sickles during the review. I wouldn't be surprised if old Abe has a good cause to shoot Sickles, as Sickles had to kill Key. So we talked about his relationship with Mary Todd Lincoln. That would continue for the rest of the war. And every once in a while, you will see the rumor in print questioning whether or not Sickles and Mary Todd had a little bit of a fling, but have never seen any concrete proof or evidence on that. But what does happen too, as his star is rising in the Army of the Potomac in the spring of 1863, Dan Sickles does also fall in with Joe Hooker. And as Hooker progressively gets advanced through the Army of the Potomac. Dan Sickles rises through the ranks with him. And so by, again, early 1863, when Joe Hooker is put in command of the Army of the Potomac, he promotes and advances his friend, his crony, Dan Sickles, into command of the Third Corps of the Union Army. Along with them is another friend, Dan Butterfield, who's chief of staff and will remain as George Meade's chief of staff during the Gettysburg campaign. And it's an interesting period during the winter of 1862-63. We have accounts and diaries talking about the party atmosphere within the Army of the Potomac as Joe Hooker was in command. They talk about having parties. They talk about women showing up in the camp, and sometimes officers are aghast. Where are all these women coming from? The drinking, a New Year's party where the drinking sort of runs in streams. One rather outraged officer wrote of that period that during that winter, command of the Army of the Potomac was compared to a barroom and brothel. It was a place where no self-respecting man or woman dared to go. But that was the social scene under Hooker, Sickles, and Dan Butterfield. Where we get into problems with Gettysburg is one of the people who was clearly excluded from that social scene was George Meade. Now, at this time, George Meade, as I'm sure many of you know, Philadelphia native, George Meade at that time was commander of the Fifth Corps within the Union Army. But what we see, and this is one of the things I always wanted to get into with my research, because I felt like a lot of people just sort of always knocked out the ensuing personality conflicts between Dan Sickles and George Meade, is sort of a stereotypical West Pointer versus non-West Pointer. And there's definitely truth in that, but there's more to the story than that. They had personality conflicts. Meade is socially excluded from this Hooker, Sickles, Butterfield trio. George Meade had also become unpopular in the Third Corps because following the Battle of Fredericksburg in December of 1862, Meade had gotten into a dispute with, ironically, another Philadelphian, David Birney, who was a division commander in the Third Corps. And this dispute made Meade unpopular within the higher echelons of the Third Corps. And then last but not least, after Chancellorsville, there's a dispute that gets into the newspapers about whether or not Hooker's subordinates had counseled Hooker to retreat after Chancellorsville. And George Meade is quoted as supporting a retreat. Meade denies that. Meade said he voted for an advance. Meade sort of starts polling the generals. Generals take sides, Meade versus Hooker. And of course, Dan Sickles supported his buddy Joe Hooker. So you have all these things going on. And, as George Meade, you go back and read his life and letters. He writes to his wife Margaret during this period. Oh, they had a party in camp, and all the generals were invited except me. And in another case, he writes to Margaret that such gentlemen as Dan Sickles and Dan Butterfield are not the persons I should select as my intimates. Now, this is February of 1863, several months before they spectacularly collide at Gettysburg. And so when George Meade replaces Hooker as commander of the Army of the Potomac on June 28th, 1863, really for the first time, Dan Sickles is out at Army headquarters. So we were talking about the personality issues between Meade and Sickles. Now we're back to July 2nd, 1863, which is really when these two guys have what is a spectacular failure to communicate on the Gettysburg battlefield. This is a map, a simple map, but a map nonetheless of General Meade's intended fishhook at Gettysburg. And you can see down near the bottom end of the map, near the Round Tops, on July 2nd, 1863, that morning, George Meade had given Dan Sickles verbal orders to occupy the left flank of the Union line at Gettysburg, which would have included occupation of the hills we know today as the Round Tops. During the course of the morning, several communications go back and forth between Meade, Sickles, and headquarters. And what becomes apparent as the day progresses is Dan Sickles does not like the position he's been assigned to. There's various reasons for this. He's going to claim later that he was either confused or uncertain of Meade's orders. He's also going to claim that he disliked some of the low ground north of Little Round Top that he had to occupy to get to Little Round Top. He's going to claim that he lacked the manpower to cover the position Meade assigned him to. And most sinisterly, later on, Sickles is going to claim that he actually advanced to prevent Meade from retreating from Gettysburg. And so, what we're representing on the map here is where I have the blue arrows. During the course of the late morning, early afternoon of July 2nd, Sickles advanced his Third Corps off of Cemetery Ridge into these advanced positions that we know today as Devil's Den, the Wheat Field, the Peach Orchard, and the Emmitsburg Road, while at the same time abandoning the Cemetery Ridge and the interior lines of Meade's Fishhook. When James Longstreet's massive attack began that afternoon of July 2nd, his goal was to envelop and drive in the left flank of the Union Army. And so Longstreet and Sickles collided on this south end of the Gettysburg battlefield in some of the most massive and bloody fighting of the Civil War. Now, one of the things people think Sickles had in mind that day was also whether or not he was trying to avoid a repeat of the Battle of Chancellorsville when Sickles had been moved out of a position known as Hazel Grove and moved back, and the Confederate Army had bombed them out of position with artillery. So some people are debating this, and we still debate this 163 years later. Why did Sickles do what he did? We're going to come back to that later in the presentation. From a military history perspective, though, what we know is that George Meade, once he found out Sickles was out of position, Meade had to go into what has been termed a crisis management mode to scramble to get reinforcements all along the Union Army's left flank. So many of the reinforcements, most famously Strong Vincent, Joshua Chamberlain, the 20th Maine, who get up to Little Round Top, these guys most famously are coming in a position to fill gaps created by Sickles. But even with heavy reinforcements, the fighting at the Devil's Den, the Wheatfield, the Peach Orchard, the heavy fighting, eventually by late afternoon, early evening of July 2nd, and symbolized by my Peach Orchard map on this screen, Sickles's position is going to be crushed by these attacks from Longstreet. And here at the Peach Orchard, which was considered the center and the key of Sickles's position, because in Sickles's view, it commanded elevated, dominating ground along the Emmitsburg Road, even during the late afternoon attacks by William Barksdale's Mississippi Brigade, are going to break Sickles's advanced line in half. So even with reinforcements, he's going to lose the ground that he moved into. His advanced position is going to fall back to Cemetery Ridge. So there's no doubt he disrupted George Meade's defense. There's no doubt about that. The question that you can ask, though, is did his unexpected movements also disrupt Lee and Longstreet's attack on July 2nd? And I would argue that that was the case, as Longstreet suffered heavy casualties fighting through what proved to be meaningless positions on the Gettysburg battlefield. And I say this because, one of the things I always get on the Dan Sickles trail is people want to know, oh, whose side are you on, George Meade or Dan Sickles? And as I said at the outset, it's not about being on anybody's side. It's trying to understand what the impact is. And I could make the case, and I will make the case, that his move forward disrupts both sides. And that's one of the reasons why you have such heavy casualties on the second day of the Battle of Gettysburg. One of those casualties is General Sickles himself, because during the late stage fighting, a Confederate artillery projectile, a solid shot, is going to come bouncing by him while he is on horseback at its headquarters, is going to strike Sickles in the right leg, shatter the bone, and he's going to be carried off the battlefield that evening where the leg will be amputated and effectively ending his military career. Now, one of the pieces of the story of this and sort of what I talked about later, his ability or earlier, I talked about earlier, his ability to reinvent himself is in later years, he's going to use the shattered missing leg. You know, you guys and ladies are probably all familiar with the term waving the bloody shirt after the Civil War. Well, Sickles, in a lot of ways, sort of waved his broken leg as a sign of valor and declaring himself as a Civil War hero, when a lot of people would have otherwise been wanting to blame him for the what almost turned into a defeat at Gettysburg. And that's why we titled today's presentation Almost a Disaster, because it was almost, but not quite a disaster for George Meade. Anyways, Mark Twain got to know Dan Sickles late in life. Mark Twain, I think, summarized how Sickles used this injury and this wound to his advantage. Mark Twain wrote that General Sickles values the leg he's lost much more than the one he's got. And if he has to part with one, I'm sure he would rather lose the one he still has. So it's a testimony to how prominent Dan Sickles was later in life that Mark Twain wrote about him. But Mark Twain's description, I think, also fits Sickles to a T. So as you get into the fall of 1863, the spring of 1864, Sickles, now with one leg, recuperates from this injury remarkably quickly. By October of 1863, he tries to come back to the army. I mean, just imagine that. You have a leg amputated, and 90 days later, you want to come back out into the field. Whatever you think of Sickles' military prowess, he had developed a love of commanding these men in the field, and he wanted to be part of the army. But given their past history and given what had occurred at Gettysburg, what do you think George Meade said when Dan Sickles tried to come back to the army? Thanks, Dan, but no thanks. And now being denied coming back to the army, that is, in my view, what really set Dan Sickles off on what I kind of call a vendetta ride against George Meade, where Sickles wanted to attack Meade's reputation. Sickles also wanted to declare himself as the hero of the Battle of Gettysburg. And Sickles also went after other officers like Henry Halleck, too, who criticized Sickles's Gettysburg performance. So again, the Gettysburg literature often portrays Sickles as some sort of sociopathic psycho who is just off trying to extract revenge on George Meade for the reasons of revenge. But really, what Sickles was hoping was if Meade had gotten removed from command of the Army of the Potomac, Sickles could potentially come back to this position he loved. And one of the ways to do that was to cooperate with the Joint Committee of the Conduct of the War, which is by the spring of 64, getting into their hearings for the Battle of Gettysburg in the time under Meade's command. Now, the radical Republicans were not favorable to West Pointers. So it might seem kind of weird that Sickles, the Democrat, is cooperating with radical Republicans who are also critical of the Lincoln administration. But again, Sickles needs to use them, and they need to use him to help Sickles get back with the army. So Sickles will testify, as will numerous other Gettysburg generals. Sickles will try to portray his move to the Peach Orchard and the Emmitsburg Road as in the best light possible. You know, he will say it was not through any misinterpretation of orders. It was either a good line or a bad one. I took it up on my own responsibility. I took it up because it enabled me to hold commanding ground. And he tries to take responsibility for what he did at Gettysburg, but he also lies a lot too. And two of his bigger whoppers are going to be that he will claim he defended Little Round Top, which he didn't. But he will also claim, too, that General Meade had wanted to retreat from Gettysburg and that by moving forward, Sickles had brought on the battle, and that really you shouldn't give Meade credit for the victory. You should give credit to Dan Sickles. And that's sort of the spin that he's going to put on this really for the remainder of his life. He also is much better than George Meade at using the newspapers to advantage. He clearly would have learned that in New York's Tammany Hall politics. One of the most memorable uses of the newspaper comes from the anonymous observer Historicus, which appears in the newspaper as George Meade is giving his own testimony before the committee. Historicus, again, an anonymous observer to the Battle of Gettysburg, will say that it has been stated upon unquestionable authority that George Meade had decided upon a retreat and that an order to withdraw had been penned by his chief of staff, Dan Butterfield. Well, remember what I said before? Dan Butterfield was in cahoots with Sickles and Hooker. So here you see sort of this great example of them coming together to really attack and besmirch George Meade. George Meade was astonished when he heard these attacks against his reputation. He testified before the committee on two occasions, did a very credible job of saving his own reputation. And one thing I want to point out is that I think the Gettysburg literature often makes George Meade out to sort of be this poor, hapless victim set upon by these politicians, and George Meade doesn't understand how to fight these politics. George Meade does actually a very credible job once he sort of gets his ducks in a row on this. George Meade does a very credible job of defending his reputation. And although he did suffer some attacks, he did stay in command of the Army of the Potomac for the remainder of the war. But unfortunately, he's going to die in 1872, whereas Dan Sickles is going to live a long life and can still be here to continue to try to persuade people about the nature of these attacks. You know, an account that was published posthumously said to be from George Meade sums it up well. You know, Meade reportedly said that Sickles's movement practically destroyed his own corps, produced the majority of my casualties, and with what result? Driving us back to the position he was ordered to originally. If this is such an advantage to be so crippled in battle without obtaining an objective, I must confess, I cannot see it. So, a very credible rebuttal from George Meade. But again, he suffers from the fact that he dies relatively young while Dan Sickles goes on. And so the debate continues in Civil War circles today. Was Meade right? Was Sickles right? Again, people assume because I'm a Dan Sickles biographer that I'm quote unquote on Sickles's side and that I'm quote unquote against George Meade. None of that is true. But what I do think is the story is more nuanced than a lot of these historians who always just make it out into a West Point versus non-West Point story have made it out into. I'll repeat what I said before. Clearly, Sickles messed up Meade's defense at Gettysburg, and had Meade not thrown reinforcements onto the Union left, it could have been disaster for him. But I do think the one benefit that Sickles's move had, as I said, was creating a lot of casualties in Longstreet's First Corps. Lee and Longstreet, fighting through Devil's Den, the wheat field, and the peach orchard, are going to capture a number of positions that are going to be meaningless to the Army of Northern Virginia in winning the Battle of Gettysburg. So, from a tactical sort of perspective, you can argue that Sickles acted as sort of a speed bump that slowed and disrupted Longstreet's attack. And as often the case in warfare, there are no real winners on that. But Sickles went on with his life, and diplomatic assignments in the late 1860s, the early 1870s. Now, Sickles' first wife, Teresa, died unfortunately very young in 1867 of disease. Sickles, meanwhile, was assigned by the Grant administration as minister to Spain in 1869. And so 1869 to 74, Sickles was overseas. He married for a second time, which is the lovely young woman here on the right-hand side of the screen. She was an attendant in the court of Queen Isabella II, who is the lovely young lady on the left-hand side of the screen. It is said that while Sickles was over in Spain, he had an affair with Queen Isabella, and that the press sarcastically dubbed him the Yankee King of Spain while he was a favorite in court with her. But rather than marrying Queen Isabella, Dan Sickles married for a second time Carolyn de Cray, who was a younger attendant in Queen Isabella's court. The story was that both Sickles and the attendant both thought the other one had money. So they married because the other one thought the other one was rich, but neither one of them had money at that time, and they were temperamentally unsuited to each other, and they never agreed on any topic. Sickles did, however, during this period, father two children, a boy and a girl with Carolyn. So, fellas, think of the physical stamina there. The guy's in his mid-50s on one leg, and he's fathering a new family while living abroad in Spain. But again, they didn't really get along. And like a lot of things in Dan Sickles' career, this minister's post starts well, ends badly, and by the mid to late 1870s, he's looking for a new assignment. Now, as we said, Meade has died in 1872, but in the late 1870s, early 1880s, Dan Sickles returned stateside, and the timing was perfect to reinvent himself once again because it was late 1870s, early 1880s when Civil War veterans were starting to take control of the memory and the memorialization of these Civil War battlefields. And that included, of course, Gettysburg. So in 1886, Dan Sickles was appointed chairman of the New York Monuments Commission for the battlefield of Gettysburg. And you see an image of him on screen here during that period coming back to the battlefield with two generals that served under him, coming back to the battlefield and to mark positions. So what he does as chairman of the New York Monuments Commission is he marks positions for where New York troops fought during the battle. They publish a very lengthy history of the battle. So much of New York's history of the Battle of Gettysburg was under the supervision and approval of Dan Sickles, and that helps get his side of the story across. He is also a popular figure during this period at veterans reunions, monument dedications. Again, I have seen historians call Dan Sickles a pariah and an outcast during this period. Nothing could be further from the truth. He was very popular at these reunions and stuff. Although, again, yes, you did have factions, people who were pro Meade, people who were pro Sickles, and as the two factions would occasionally butt heads on this. This is going to go in through the 1890s. In 1892, he would actually be reelected to Congress. So, once again, 30 plus years or so after he had left Congress following the scandal of the Philip Barton Key affair, he is back in Congress in the 1890s, and it's a remarkable, in my opinion, American reinvention story. He doesn't do a lot during this last term in Congress, except in 1895, he will introduce the legislation that creates Gettysburg National Military Park. So, in some ways, and again, his critics will argue that other people were more involved than he was, but it's the Sickles bill, folks. They call the bill that creates Gettysburg National Military Park the Sickles bill. They don't name it after anyone else. And it's the Sickles bill that pushes through the creation of Gettysburg National Military Park. Say what you want about him as a husband, as a father, as a friend or enemy of George Meade, or as a military strategist. Say what you want, but early battlefield preservation was important to this guy. Now, one of the interesting pieces of the story is he goes to these reunions and stuff during this period is he becomes friendly with his July 2nd opponent, James Longstreet. So you have critics in the North who are questioning Sickles's movements at Gettysburg. You have critics in the South who are questioning James Longstreet's actions at Gettysburg. It becomes obvious and apparent that these two guys are going to become friendly with each other and will mutually support each other for the rest of their remaining lives. There's a lot of stories about this at the various reunions and stuff. One of my favorites comes from Atlanta in the early 1890s. Sickles and Longstreet are heading back to their hotels after a day and an evening of celebrating and drinking. And as they told the story later, Sickles said to Longstreet at one point, "You know, Longstreet, one of these days you need to apologize for shooting my leg off." And Longstreet reportedly rebutted, "Apologize. You should thank me for leaving you one leg to still stand on." And it was with that sort of banter that these two guys spent their golden twilight years. Now, this is an image of Sickles, Longstreet, and several other prominent Union officers. Next to Longstreet is Dan Butterfield, but several prominent Union officers attending a Gettysburg reunion. This is said to be the 25th anniversary, which would have been in 1888. But Longstreet more or less went to his grave believing and publicly arguing that Sickles's move forward had actually won the battle for the Union Army at Gettysburg. Quote, "I believe it is now conceded that the advanced position at the Peach Orchard, taken by your corps and under your orders, saved that battlefield to the Union cause." And Longstreet wrote that in 1902, shortly before his own death. Did Longstreet believe that? Was he supporting his buddy? We'll never know, but Longstreet was consistent on that for the rest of his life. And the other person I'll point out in this image, so you have Longstreet here, where my cursor is, two down from Longstreet. Do you let folks recognize this guy with the white mustache and the top hat? It's Joshua Chamberlain of the 20th Maine. So at that time, would have been probably the ex-governor Chamberlain. But anyways, Governor Chamberlain of Maine, former colonel of the 20th Maine, Joshua Chamberlain hanging out at these reunions with evil devil Dan Sickles. And what might that even tell us about Joshua Chamberlain? Okay, one more story here as we kind of bring things into the home stretch. Sickles remains a public figure, remains in the newspapers for the rest of his days, and chairman of the New York Monuments Commission. Now, as you get to 1912, the eve of the 50th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg, New York State does an audit of the commission's books, and they find out $28,000 were unaccounted for which Chairman Sickles has no receipts. This was a very messy public funding scandal. It played in all the newspapers, the New York Times, all across the country, really. And as you're now looking at a Civil War quote unquote hero in his mid 90s, a former two-time congressman, Sickles is threatened with jail time unless he can come up with the money to reimburse New York State. Well, he doesn't have $28,000. Now, he had inherited $4 million from his father in the late 1880s and early 1890s. $4 million back then would be worth something like $100 million today. And Sickles had blown through that inheritance. So not only did he not have the money to pay back New York State, but he was bankrupt at this point. All of that was very well played out in the newspapers. Finally, Sickles's estranged second wife came back from Spain to the States to try to reconcile with him. She actually pawned some of her jewelry from the court of Queen Isabella to try to pay back some of the money, but Sickles would not reconcile with her in part because Sickles was taking up with his housekeeper, sort of a mysterious figure here that's in the images by the name of Eleanor Wilmerding. So that is Wilmerding, and that is Wilmerding over here. So Sickles stayed with the housekeeper. He wouldn't get back with the second wife. She pawned some of her jewelry, but at the end of the day, New York State never recovered about $23,000 of the missing funds. Once again, though, as Dan Sickles has done throughout his life, he evaded jail time. He signed an agreement with his lawyer. He didn't get jail time. New York avoided what could have been an embarrassing public relations scandal. And so he did. He was able to come to Pennsylvania in July 1913 to attend the 50th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg. And that was really his last visit to Gettysburg. It was supposedly at the 50th anniversary where one of his friends said to him, Sickles, how do you feel about not having a monument on the field? Because there's no statue here. And he reportedly said, don't worry about it. The whole damn battlefield is my monument. Now, that may or may not be apocryphal, but kind of like the man who shot Liberty Valance. If it didn't happen that way, it should have, because I think that quote is pure Dan Sickles. Less than a year later, Dan Sickles died. About 95 years old, he died of a cerebral hemorrhage in May of 1914 while he was at home in New York City. One of the things, and I'm always reminded of this quote that I put up in the top hand right side of the screen, back in the dawn of the internet when you had these various chat rooms and such, again, there was always this perception that Dan Sickles was an outcast, he was a pariah, when in fact he was very much a public figure for the rest of his life. But one guy who I always pay tribute to, one guy had written that Sickles was so despised that no one attended his funeral. Well, folks, we have pictures of Dan Sickles' funeral. Here's the funeral. I would say, yeah, a few people did attend that one. And he received a military honor guard type of funeral, paraded through the streets of New York to huge, huge crowds. I think the New York Times, in this case, got it right with their May 5th, 1914 obituary on Sickles. And what they said was nobody with warm blood can read the obituary of Sickles without a certain thrill of admiration. And they acknowledged all of the good moments and bad moments he had had in his long life. But as it was, He filled many important positions in civil and military life, and he was always conspicuous in the minds of his contemporaries. It was an adventurous life, and folks, I would argue that all of us here today, most of us here today, could hope to have the type of resume or the type of adventures that he had. Right or wrong, it was a life well led. There was sort of a postscript of the story. They fought about Dan Sickles one more time, even in death, as they were trying to sort through what was left of his bankrupt estate. They came down to the question of where did he want to be buried? Well, his second wife wanted him to be buried at Gettysburg, and arrangements were starting to be made to have him buried in Gettysburg's National Cemetery. However, Sickles' attorneys stepped in and say, no, 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 he had expressed his wishes to me that he wanted to be buried in Arlington National Cemetery. The guy who started out as the congressman who got away with murder wanted to be buried in Arlington Cemetery, a soldier's cemetery, as a soldier. And the attorney, which was said to be Sickles' wishes, trumped the wishes of the second wife, and Sickles was buried in Arlington Cemetery. That's the stone, and that is where he rests today. Every once in a while, 1980s, 1990s, there would be an effort or two to try to get him exhumed and moved back to Gettysburg. But the individuals who were primarily championing that effort have all passed on, and I don't think anything will ever come to that. So there he rests in Arlington Cemetery. So, going back to my early premise of an important guy in the Gettysburg story, look, he established Gettysburg National Military Park. He helped establish the boundaries, which were in fact until the 1970s. He doesn't have a statue on the battlefield, but we have Sickles Avenue. We have numerous monuments on the battlefield. Under his leadership, New York placed 88 monuments on the battlefield. We have locations such as Devil's Den, the Wheat Field, and the Peach Orchard. For better or worse, his influence on the battle, the historiography, and the battlefield clearly makes him one of our most influential figures at Gettysburg. As we look at what could be my favorite image of him, 1913 at that 50th anniversary, what's he doing? He's signing autographs. He's got a cigar hanging out of his mouth. You can see the crutches in the background, and the veterans were lined up to get one more autograph session with old Dan Sickles. And beyond that, you have a man, a politician, New York State Senate, 2 terms in Congress, the Monument Commission, his role in the United States Army, a Medal of Honor recipient, political positions. It goes on and on. And as I said at the outset, fine, not asking you to like Dan Sickles as a person. Hopefully, though, in sort of our run through of 95 years here in about 50 minutes, hopefully in our run through that, you get a better appreciation of why he is important to the Gettysburg story, why he is important to the Eastern theater of the Civil War, and why he was just sort of a colorful rogue who graced the American political stage for nearly the entire 19th century. Now, as I said, he was a popular speaker at the end, particularly at the end of his life. One particular Sons of Union Veterans type of reunion, probably a GAR reunion. The veterans were pounding, how long might Sickles talk? And they were pounding on the table, talk all night, Sickles, talk all night. Well, I don't have all night. I have about an hour, and I think I've pretty much wrapped it up at this point. Thank you again for attending. Thank you all for those who've hung in for giving me your time on this Sunday afternoon.
Well, thank you very much, everybody. Enjoy this rest of the beautiful day out here. And it was great seeing everybody. We'll see you next month. Thanks, Jim.